Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to take a patient, academic look at a real high-stakes detective problem out on the high seas. You see, when you're out on the open ocean, trailing a suspect vessel, the rules that govern what law enforcement can and literally cannot do change dramatically. We're going to build a comprehensive understanding of exactly how this jurisdictional puzzle works, and we'll do it from the ground up, step by step. Today, we are exploring the legal framework of maritime drug trafficking, a topic that matters because stopping illicit drugs at sea requires navigating a complex maze of international jurisdiction and state sovereignty. All right, so here is our roadmap for today. First, the 1988 Vienna Convention. Second, the UNCLOS jurisdictional gap. Third, the shipwriter workaround. Fourth, India's enforcement and geography. And fifth, we'll finish up with a course recap. Let's dive in. Section 1. The 1988 Vienna Convention. To kick things off, we really have to wrap our heads around a fundamental structural problem of the high seas. When a vessel is sailing in international waters, it is presumably under the exclusive jurisdiction of its flag state. That just means the country whose flag it flies. You can't simply pull over a foreign ship like you'd pull over a car on the highway. To solve this structural problem specifically for narcotics, the international community had to create a dedicated legal framework. In plain English, if a law enforcement cutter suspects a foreign ship of smuggling drugs on the open ocean, they can't just board it. They actually need permission from the country where that ship is registered. The precise legal term and provision for this rule is the 1988 Vienna Convention, specifically Article 17. The UN Convention Against Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances of 1988 is the core treaty here, and Article 17 is the operative provision that governs trafficking by sea through a strict, consent-based mechanism. Think of it kind of like needing a homeowner's permission to search a house. Unless, of course, that house is clearly abandoned. Let's translate that back into strict international law, because the analogy doesn't replace the rule. Here is the exact Article 17 mechanism. Step 1. A state suspecting a foreign-flagged vessel of drug trafficking must officially request authorization from the flag state to board, search, and take action. Step 2. The flag state responds. They can authorize the requesting state to act, they can choose to conduct their own enforcement, or they can attach specific conditions to their authorization. And Step 3. The critical exception. Stateless vessels. A vessel with no genuine nationality or one falsely claiming a nationality gets zero flag state protection. In that specific case, any state may board and search without needing anyone's permission. Let's move right along to Section 2, the UNCLOS jurisdictional gap. So we've established that Article 17 requires consent. But what about the big, overarching treaty that governs the world's oceans? Well, here is where we discover a major operational gap. You'll often hear about UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, UNCLOS Article 108 does cover this issue, but in a very broad way. It obligates states to cooperate in suppressing illicit drug traffic on the high seas. But while this rule demands international teamwork, it actually has absolutely no teeth for boardings. It lacks an operational boarding procedure, which forces law enforcement to rely entirely back on that consent-based mechanism of Article 17 of the 1988 Vienna Convention that we just went over. UNCLOS Article 110 gives a warship something called the right of visit, which is the power to board a foreign vessel on the high seas without needing flag state consent. But this power is only granted for very specific grounds: piracy, the slave trade, statelessness, flying a false flag, or unauthorized broadcasting. Yes, you heard that right. Pirate radio will get you boarded by a warship. But notice what is conspicuously missing here. Drug trafficking is explicitly not on that list. You can think of UNCLOS Article 110 like a VIP access pass to a building that specifically excludes the one single room you actually need to enter. That's the analogy, but let's reinforce the strict rule so we're absolutely clear. The rule is that drug trafficking lacks Article 110 right of visit privileges. A warship cannot invoke Article 110 to board a suspected drug trafficking vessel simply because of the trafficking suspicion alone. Enforcement must go through the consent-based 1988 Convention mechanism instead, or through a bilateral agreement. Section 3, the shipwriter workaround. Now, practically speaking, waiting around for a foreign capital to grant permission on a case-by-case basis while you are trailing a fast-moving suspect vessel on the open ocean, that's highly inefficient. So, to solve the delay of these flag state authorizations, a pretty clever geopolitical hack was developed, primarily in Caribbean counter-narcotics cooperation. What's elegantly brilliant about this workaround is exactly how it bypasses that bureaucratic delay of consent. Instead of radioing headquarters to ask a foreign government for permission, You simply bring a representative of that foreign government right on board your ship with you. The formal definition for this is a shipwriter agreement. These are bilateral arrangements where a law enforcement officer from one state embarks on another state's patrol vessel, allowing that vessel to exercise the embarked officer's state's enforcement authority in real time. As an analogy, it's a bit like giving a trusted friend the legal keys to drive your jurisdiction. But again, let's cement the precise rule here. Shipwriter agreements legally allow for real-time enforcement and boarding without waiting for Article 17 case-by-case flag state authorization, because the embarked officer already holds the authority of their home state. Section 4. India's Enforcement and Geography. Okay, we have covered the international legal theory. Now, we're going to ground this framework into a specific, jurisdictional reality by examining India's maritime enforcement environment. Every single country must enact domestic laws to enforce these international treaties. For India, the primary domestic legal tool is the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, or the NDPS Act of 1985. This statute has extraterritorial reach, meaning it applies to offenses committed on Indian-flagged ships absolutely anywhere in the world. Furthermore, it specifically empowers India's maritime enforcers, so the Coast Guard, Customs, and the Navy, to take action under its provisions. So why is this so absolutely critical for India? Well, geography matters immensely here. India sits in a highly vulnerable spot, directly sandwiched between two massive drug-producing regions. To the west, you have the Golden Crescent, comprising Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, and to the east is the Golden Triangle, made up of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. Because of this positioning, the Arabian sea routes flowing out of the Golden Crescent serve as a persistent, high-volume trafficking corridor. The Indian Coast Guard regularly conducts large-scale narcotic seizures off the Gujarat and Kerala coasts, which frequently requires them to coordinate with international partners, precisely because of the flag state consent rules we learned about earlier. Let's look at a concrete case illustration to apply everything we've learned so far. Here are the facts. The Indian Coast Guard spots a foreign-flagged vessel behaving suspiciously in the Arabian Sea outside Indian territorial waters, out on the high seas. The legal issue is, does India have jurisdiction to board? The holding, or legal conclusion, based on our framework is no. Unless the vessel turns out to be entirely stateless, India cannot simply board it, because UN Close Article 110, that right of visit, does not apply to drug trafficking. Therefore, to execute the boarding, India must either request flag state authorization under Article 17 of the 1988 Vienna Convention or rely on an existing bilateral shipwriter-style agreement. This matters tremendously because it perfectly demonstrates how the lack of a universal boarding right for narcotics actively shapes real-world high seas law enforcement. Section 5. Structured Course Recap. The crucial point here is that understanding maritime drug enforcement really means understanding the strict limits of jurisdiction. It is time to review and solidify everything we've covered today to make sure you have complete mastery of this topic. Take a moment to check your own notes against this final summary. First, we introduced the 1988 Vienna Convention, which is the core treaty governing this entire issue. Second, we defined Article 17, which dictates the strict consent-based mechanism required to board foreign-flagged vessels, with the sole exception being stateless vessels. Third, we looked at UN Close Article 108, which mandates general cooperation but provides no operational boarding powers. Fourth, we examined UN Close Article 110, identifying the critical right of visit gap, the fact that warships can board for piracy or slave trading but completely lack the power to board for drug trafficking. Fifth, we explored shipwriter agreements, the really clever bilateral workaround to bypass the delays of case-by-case consent. And finally, we reviewed the NDPS Act of 1985 and the Arabian Sea case, demonstrating how India navigates these exact international limits while situated right between the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. You know, the jurisdictional limitation we've discussed today doesn't just apply to narcotics. In fact, drug trafficking and the massive, sanctions-evading vessels known as shadow fleets share this exact same jurisdictional protection on the high seas. Which leads us to this question. If drug traffickers and shadow fleets exploit the exact same jurisdictional gap, is it time to rewrite UN Clause Article 110? Thank you for joining this explainer and keep questioning the frameworks that govern our oceans.